Oakland, California, 1951. A quiet afternoon. Two children playing in a familiar park, their laughter echoing through a working-class neighborhood. But within minutes, one of them was gone. No cries for help, no trace. As if the child had vanished into thin air. Adults searched the streets, police combed the waterfront and every hidden corner. Yet nothing surfaced, no body, no clue, only a void, and questions no one could answer. Days turned into years, and years into decades, until 70 years had passed. And only then did the truth finally begin to emerge. In the summer of 1950, a young mother stepped off a train in California with 6 children in tow and the weight of a new life pressing down on her shoulders. Her name was Antonia Albino, and she had left behind Puerto Rico, an island that offered her little but hardship to chase the fragile promise of opportunity in the United States. She carried with her not wealth, not status, but determination. An unshakable belief that if she worked hard enough, her children might one day have more than she had ever known. Her new home was in West Oakland, a district that had swelled during the war years, but was already beginning to fray at the edges. It was a place of contradictions, the hum of freight trains cutting through neighborhoods, the heavy smell of oil and smoke, the shouts of dock workers spilling from taverns at night. To outsiders, Oakland was booming, alive with industry. To those who lived in its working-class quarters, it was a place where survival demanded grit and sacrifice. Antonia settled into a modest house on Brush Street. It was cramped, noisy, and never quite warm in the winter, but it was shelter. She made do with what she had, stretching every penny to cover food and clothing. During the day, she picked fruit, her hands scratched and calloused from hours of labor. At night, she sewed gloves by lamplight, her eyes burning from exhaustion. Her body carried the strain of double shifts, but her spirit refused to break. For her, there was no alternative. She was both mother and father to her children, the sole anchor in a life of uncertainty. Among the children was her youngest son, Luis, born around 1945. At 6 years old, he embodied innocence. Neighbors recalled him as a boy with wide, trusting eyes and a boundless curiosity. He was small, still clinging to the kind of childlike wonder that made the world seem bright, even in the grittiest of neighborhoods. He was too young to sense the dangers that lurked, too young to question promises, too young to know that sometimes the world was not safe. Luis's closest companion was his older brother, Roger, who at 10 had already begun to feel the weight of responsibility. Where Luis was carefree, Roger was cautious. He translated for his mother when she confronted the outside world, helped keep the younger siblings in line, and acted as a protector. Luis adored him. He followed Roger everywhere, eager to match his pace, to share in his games, to lean on the quiet assurance that his brother would never let anything happen to him. The Albino household was noisy, filled with the sounds of 6 children crammed into a small space. Quarrels broke out as easily as laughter. The clatter of dishes, the shuffle of feet, the cries of children. It was constant. Privacy was rare. Yet within that noise, there was love. Antonia, though stern when needed, nurtured her children with a fierceness born of hardship. She insisted on discipline, on respect, on faith. She marched them to church on Sundays, their mismatched clothes pressed as neatly as she could manage. She taught them to pray, to endure, to hope. Still, beneath her strength, there was fear. Antonia knew the world could be merciless. She reminded her children often not to wander too far, not to trust too easily. Her older children noticed the way her fingers tightened around her rosary whenever news came of violence or tragedy in the neighborhood. They saw the sigh in her voice, when she warned them to stay close. They understood, in ways children should not have to, that safety was fragile. West Oakland in the early 1950s was a place of flux. During the war, the shipyards and factories had drawn thousands of families, many African American migrants from the South, others immigrants from Latin America and the Caribbean. Cultures collided on crowded streets where gospel music drifted from one corner and Spanish from another. Yet alongside that diversity came tension, neglect, and poverty. The city's resources rarely reached neighborhoods like Brush Street. Schools were underfunded, streets cracked and poorly lit, and the police, when they did appear, were viewed with suspicion rather than trust. For children like Luis and Roger, the park near their home was a refuge. Jefferson Square was not grand, just swings, a slide, and patches of worn grass. But to them it was a kingdom. There they could run without restraint, laugh without worry, and escape, for a while, the heaviness of life inside their crowded home. Roger watched over Luis on those afternoons, keeping him close, guiding him with the unspoken duty that older siblings often carry. Yet even in moments of joy, the fragility of their world was clear. One wrong turn, one accident, one cruel twist of fate, and everything could change. Antonia knew this better than anyone. She carried that fear quietly, never voicing it fully, but it lingered in the set of her jaw, in the way she watched her children leave the house, in the prayers she whispered late at night. By February of 1951, the Albino family had found a rhythm. Their life was not easy, but it was steady. Antonia worked, the children attended school, and in the afternoons they escaped to the park. Luis was still small enough to cling to innocence, Roger old enough to sense responsibility, and Antonia strong enough to keep them all afloat. No one could have guessed that within days, that fragile balance would shatter, that the little boy with trusting eyes would vanish in the space of minutes, that the family who had come to Oakland in search of a new beginning would instead be marked by a loss so profound it would echo for more than 70 years. The afternoon of February 21st, 1951, carried no warning. It was a gray day in Oakland, the sky low and heavy, the air cool enough that children's breath still fogged faintly as they ran. In Jefferson Square Park, the Albino brothers played as they always did. Roger, 10, took the lead. Luis, only 6, trailed faithfully behind. To them, the patch of swings and dirt paths was a kingdom. For a time it was laughter, the creak of metal chains, the ordinary noise of children at play. Then, in an instant, Roger's world tilted. Something unsettled him. His younger brother was no longer close by. Panic shot through him with the clarity only children know. Without hesitation, he turned and ran. He tore down Brush Street, heart pounding, lungs burning, every stride a desperate beat of urgency. Bursting through the doorway of the crowded Albino home, he gasped for breath, words tumbling out in a mix of Spanish and English. Luis, he went. There was a woman. She talked to him. He followed her. The room froze. Antonia's eyes widened, her body stiffened as if struck. A neighbor stepped closer, trying to catch Roger's words. Antonia clutched at her apron, demanding he repeat himself. He did, trembling, his small hands gesturing wildly. A strange woman had spoken to Luis. She had coaxed him. Luis had gone with her. The effect was immediate. Chairs scraped back. Coats were grabbed. Antonia, with neighbors at her side, rushed into the street. Roger, still breathless, led the way, his voice rising as he pointed. This way! She took him this way! They hurried down the block, fear quickening every step. Roger's face was pale, his eyes wide with the terror of someone who already sensed the enormity of what was happening. The group reached the park. Roger pointed frantically to the swings, to the slide, to the place where he had last seen his brother. But Luis was gone. The park lay eerily still. The swings moved idly in the breeze, creaking as though a child had just left them. The slide gleamed faintly under the dim sky, but the boy was nowhere. Antonia's voice broke as she screamed his name, Spanish cries carrying into the neighborhood. Neighbors scattered, searching behind fences, down alleys, near the tracks. Roger called out too, his small voice ragged with desperation. His mind reeled. He had gone for help, done exactly what he thought was right, and yet it had been too late. The panic spread quickly through Brush Street. Families poured into the street, whispers turning to shouts. A boy is missing. A woman took him. The neighborhood, accustomed to hardship, now carried the sharp edge of fear. When the police arrived, the scene was chaos. Antonia, shaking, clung to a neighbor who tried to translate her words. Roger stood before the officers, trembling, forced to retell what had happened. His account spilled out. A woman, perhaps in her 30s, with a scarf over her hair. She had spoken to Luis in Spanish. She had promised candy. Luis had followed. Roger had run home for help. The officers listened, but their faces betrayed doubt. They pressed Roger for details. What exactly did she look like? Which direction had they gone? Could he be sure? His answers faltered, tangled in fear. He was only 10. His memory, blurred by panic, lacked the clarity they demanded. Skepticism hardened quickly. A child's testimony was unreliable, they reasoned. Perhaps there had been no woman at all. Perhaps Luis had simply wandered. The bay was close, and accidents were common. Children drowned there every year. It was easier to believe that explanation than to consider abduction. So the official theory took shape. Luis had fallen into the water. The Coast Guard was summoned. Boats cut across the waters of Jack London Square, searchlights sweeping the fog. Divers plunged into the murky depths. Nets dragged the shoreline. For days they searched, but nothing appeared. No body, no clothing, no trace. Antonia refused to accept it. She had heard Roger's words, seen the terror etched into his young face. She trusted him. She believed him. Luis had been taken. But every time she tried to say so, her voice faltered against the wall of language. Spanish spilled from her in a torrent of urgency, but to the officers it came only through halting translations. The rawness, the desperation, never survived the passage. For the police, the case grew cold quickly. For the Albino family, the nightmare had just begun. At home, silence replaced laughter. The chair at the table where Luis had once sat became unbearable to look at. Antonia hovered by the doorway in the evenings, as if willing her boy to return. The siblings grew quieter, their games dulled by grief. And Roger carried the heaviest burden of all. He had seen, he had run, he had brought help. And when they returned, Luis was gone. That choice, made in the panic of childhood, became the wound he carried for life. Again and again he replayed it in his mind. He should have held Luis's hand. He should have shouted louder. He should never have left. The guilt sank into him like stone. The disappearance did not end at the park that day. It echoed through every meal, every prayer, every whisper in the house on Brush Street. It clung to Roger's silence, to Antonia's desperate visits to the police, to the siblings' uneasy glances at the empty swing in the park. A little boy had vanished in minutes. A mother had lost her child. A brother had lost his shadow. And a family had been thrust into a story of absence that would stretch on for 73 years. The days after Luis vanished stretched into a haze of fear and exhaustion. The Albino home on Brush Street no longer rang with the noise of children. Even when the siblings quarreled or cried, their voices carried a muted quality, as though they, too, were afraid to break the silence that Luis had left behind. Antonia did not rest. She could not. Each morning, before the fog had lifted from the bay, she rose with a single purpose: to find her son. Her body ached from long shifts in the orchards and nights spent sewing gloves, but fatigue had no place against the demand of a missing child. She walked to the police station, often with Roger or one of the older children by her side, a neighbor sometimes trailing along to translate. Her Spanish spilled from her in desperate waves, her words hurried, insistent. "My son was taken. He did not drown. Please, find him." But the officers, already unconvinced by Roger's account, offered little more than polite shrugs. They told her again that the bay had been searched thoroughly, that accidents happen, that without more evidence there was nothing to pursue. Each time she left the station with her shoulders stooped a little more, her faith clinging to the thinnest thread. At first she went every day, then every week, then every month. As the years passed, her visits dwindled to once a year, but she never stopped. To the clerks and officers who saw her, she became a familiar figure. The immigrant woman with dark eyes, clutching a fading photograph of a boy frozen at 6 years old. They pitied her persistence, but did not share her urgency. To them, the case was finished. To her, it was unbearable silence. For Roger, the wound cut deeper still. He had been the one to see, the one to run, the one to return with help too late. At 10 years old, he had done exactly what adults tell children to do: fetch a grown-up. But that knowledge did not protect him from guilt. In his mind, he had failed his brother. He should have stayed, should have shouted louder, should have held Luis's hand and never let go. That sense of failure hardened into a scar that never faded. Roger grew quieter in the months that followed. His laughter, once easy, became rare. At school, he avoided the park, avoided questions from other children. At home, he lingered near the window, staring out at the street as though expecting Luis to return. Each time his mother asked him to retell the story to the police, he did so with a trembling voice. The more he repeated it, the heavier it became, until it was less a memory and more a confession. The other children bore the loss differently. Some grew angry, frustrated by the unanswered questions. Others grew silent, unwilling to speak Luis's name for fear of reopening the wound. But whether spoken or unspoken, the absence was constant. At meals, the empty chair gnawed at them. On birthdays, the missing candles burned in their imagination. At Christmas, when gifts were exchanged, the children whispered Luis's name into the air, a silent prayer that he might be out there, alive, waiting. Antonia carried her grief with a ferocity that astonished neighbors. They saw her march to the police station year after year. They heard her prayers in Spanish, whispered as she fingered her rosary beads late at night. They watched her grow thinner, more worn, but never surrender to despair. "She refused to give up," one neighbor would later say, "even when no one else believed she did." Still, grief has its price. The lines on Antonia's face deepened, carved not only by work but by longing. Her hair turned silver sooner than it should have. She aged in a way that grief forces upon people, not just in body, but in spirit. Her faith in God kept her moving, but her eyes always carried the shadow of what had been lost. Years passed. Oakland changed. Freeways carved through West Oakland, scattering neighbors and tearing at the community. Families who had once lived side by side moved away. Factories closed, jobs disappeared, crime rose. But for the Albinos, time did not move forward. They were still stuck in 1951, in that February afternoon when Roger ran for help and returned to find the world forever altered. In the 1960s, when Luis would have been a young man, Antonia clung to hope with renewed strength. "He will come back," she told her children. "He is out there." She imagined him in uniform, serving the country, or perhaps working a trade, building a life of his own. She imagined him remembering her, seeking her out. Those dreams kept her alive, even as the police offered no progress, no answers. Roger carried his guilt into adulthood. He married, raised a family, worked steadily, but the shadow of his brother never left. Those who knew him described him as a man marked by quiet sorrow, a seriousness that never lifted. He avoided talking about the park. He avoided reminiscing about childhood. And when he did speak of Luis, his voice faltered, heavy with the weight of confession. He never forgave himself for running that day. The Albino household tried to move forward because life demanded it. Bills needed paying, children needed schooling, food needed cooking. But every joy was tempered by the absence of Luis. Every wedding, every birth, every milestone carried the reminder that someone was missing. Every sorrow was sharpened by the knowledge that grief had already entered their home decades before. For Antonia, the hardest part was not death, but unknowing. A death certificate, a body, even a grave, these could be mourned. But absence was unbearable. She clung to Roger's testimony as truth, repeating it year after year. "A woman took him," she would say. "He is alive somewhere. I know it." And though others pitied her, even dismissed her as a woman chasing shadows, she held fast. To give up was to bury her son twice. By the time Antonia died in 2005, she had lived more than 50 years without answers. Her children gathered at her funeral, knowing she had gone to her grave with the question still burning in her heart. Where is Luis? They carried that question themselves, passing it silently into the next generation. The disappearance was not a single event, but an echo, repeating through the years. It shaped Antonia's faith, Roger's guilt, the siblings' memories, and even the grandchildren's sense of identity. Luis was not simply a boy who vanished. He was the ghost at every meal, the shadow in every photograph, the absence that refused to fade. To the world outside, his story had been forgotten, buried in the files of the Oakland police. But for the Albino family, February 21st, 1951, was never the past. It was always the present, a wound that never healed, a silence that never broke. By the mid-1960s, 15 years had passed since the day Luis vanished from Jefferson Square Park. The world outside had changed. Elvis had risen and fallen. Presidents had come and gone. Wars had begun in far-off jungles. But for the Albino family, time remained tethered to a single afternoon in 1951. Luis was still 6 years old in their memories, his face frozen in photographs, his voice carried only in recollections whispered late at night. And yet, even in the face of silence, hope endured. In 1966, Luis would have been 21, the age when every young man in America was registered for military service. It was a milestone that lit a small flame in the Albino household. Perhaps, they reasoned, if Luis was alive, if he had grown up under another name, his records might now appear somewhere in the government's files. Military exams, draft boards, enlistments, surely a trail would exist. The siblings and their mother tried to search. They visited offices, wrote letters, asked questions. Roger, now a young man, carried the weight of his testimony with him into adulthood and threw himself into the effort. But the records gave them nothing. Luis's name was absent, a void in the bureaucracy that mirrored the void in their lives. The failure cut deep. For Antonia, the military search had been a lifeline, something to cling to as proof that her son might be alive. When the effort collapsed, it left her more determined but also more isolated. She refused to let the matter rest. Yet with each passing year, the world around her seemed to turn away, uninterested in a mystery that had grown cold. The family turned their gaze back to Puerto Rico, the homeland Antonia still carried in her heart. Perhaps Luis had been taken there, returned to the island under some pretense. More than once, Antonia and her older children made the journey back across the Caribbean. They carried with them the faded photograph of Luis, showing it to strangers, asking questions in villages and towns. Have you seen this boy? Did anyone arrive here with a child around this age? The answers were always the same. No. People shook their heads kindly, some with sympathy, others with impatience. The boy in the photograph might as well have been a ghost. Each trip ended in disappointment, each return to Oakland heavier than the last. The years accumulated. Antonia aged, her hair turning white, her steps slowing, but her persistence remained. She visited the Missing Persons Bureau less often now, sometimes once a year, always clutching the same worn image of Luis. The officers no longer knew what to tell her. They offered polite nods, pitying looks, but no answers. The file remained in its cabinet, untouched, gathering dust. Roger carried the burden silently. He grew into middle age with the memory of that day still lodged like a thorn in his heart. He built a life, but he never shed the guilt. Each time the family tried again, searching records, traveling to Puerto Rico, he felt the wound reopen. He was the brother who had seen, who had run, who had returned too late. Nothing could erase that. The other siblings carried the loss in quieter ways. Some tried to bury it, refusing to speak Luis's name for fear of prolonging the pain. Others insisted on remembering him, invoking his memory at family gatherings, ensuring that he was never erased. But whether spoken or silent, Luis was always present, the missing piece of every celebration, the shadow in every photograph. As the decades passed, Oakland itself transformed. Freeways cut through neighborhoods, displacing families. Industries that once promised work closed their doors. Crime rose, and communities fractured. Yet for the albinos, the city's changes were background noise. Their grief was timeless, anchored not in politics or economics, but in the loss of a boy who had been with them one day and gone the next. By the 1980s and 1990s, hope had grown fragile. DNA testing was beginning to emerge as a tool in law enforcement, but it was still years away from being widely accessible. For families like the albinos, there was no path forward but faith. Antonia clung to that faith fiercely. She prayed every night, whispering Luis's name as though it might reach across the years and the miles. She told her children over and over, "He is alive. Somewhere he is alive." But time is cruel. In 2005, Antonia passed away. She had lived more than half a century without answers, her prayers unanswered, her hope undimmed but unfulfilled. Her children buried her knowing she had carried the question with her to the grave. Where was Luis? The loss of their mother deepened the sorrow. For the siblings, it felt like the final blow. The woman who had carried the flame the longest was gone, and the mystery remained. Roger, already marked by guilt, felt the absence of both his brother and his mother press down on him with unbearable weight. By then, Luis had been missing for over 50 years. To the city, to the police, to the newspapers, his story was ancient history, forgotten and irrelevant. But to the albino family, it was as raw as the day it happened. The absence defined them, shaping every generation that followed. Children grew up hearing the story of the uncle who vanished, of the grandmother who never stopped searching. They inherited not only the memory but the sorrow, the sense of something missing from their family tree. The case was a cold file in the Oakland Police Department, but in the albino household, it was never cold. It was alive, burning quietly, even as decades passed and the world forgot. And then, In the 21st century, a tool would emerge that neither Antonia nor Roger could have imagined, a tool that would finally pierce the silence. For nearly 3/4 of a century, the disappearance of Luis Armando Albino existed as both a wound and a silence. His mother Antonia had gone to her grave without answers. His brother Roger carried the guilt of that day like a stone in his chest. His sisters told and retold the story until it became family legend, each detail etched into memory, but never completed. To outsiders, Luis was little more than a name in a forgotten case file. To his family, he was a shadow, always present, never seen. By the 2000s, the case was as cold as any could be. There were no new witnesses to interview, no suspects left alive to question, no physical evidence that could be tested. For decades, law enforcement had little more than Roger's trembling childhood testimony. A woman with a scarf promised candy, and Luis followed. It was the kind of detail skeptics dismissed, the kind of story a grieving mother repeated until it hardened into myth. And then, in the most unlikely of ways, the silence broke. In 2020, one of Luis's nieces, Alida Alequin, decided to take a consumer DNA test. She was not motivated by the cold case, nor by any expectation of discovery. Like millions of others, she was simply curious. Services like Ancestry and 23andMe had exploded in popularity, marketed as windows into heritage, tools to trace ancestry back through centuries. People mailed off small vials of saliva and received back pie charts, percentages, and connections to distant cousins scattered across the globe. Alida wanted to know more about her family's Puerto Rican roots. She wanted to see where the threads of her DNA would lead. But when her results arrived, hidden among the expected names and matches, one connection stood out. A man she did not know, flagged as a close relative. The system predicted roughly a 22% match, the genetic relationship consistent with an uncle. She froze. Her family did not have any lost uncles, except one. The uncle whose name had been whispered at gatherings, whose photo had faded in drawers, whose absence had shaped generations. Luis. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the screen. The number, the name, the face attached to the profile. It didn't make sense, and yet it made perfect sense. Could it be? After nearly 70 years, had the algorithm, with its cold string of percentages, just uncovered the impossible? Alida's first instinct was to reach out. She drafted messages, careful, respectful, explaining who she was and why the DNA match mattered. She hit send and waited, her heart leaping each time her phone buzzed. But days turned into weeks, and no reply came. Perhaps the man didn't see the message. Perhaps he ignored it, mistaking it for a scam, or perhaps he knew more than he was willing to admit. Each unanswered attempt chipped away at her hope. The thread felt fragile, as though the past had dangled an answer just out of reach, only to snap it away again. For a time, Alida let it rest. Life demanded her attention. Work, children, responsibilities. But the idea never left her. It hovered at the edges of her mind, whispering every time she looked at her family. What if Luis is alive? What if he's been out there all along? By early 2024, the weight of history pressed harder. Alida thought of her grandmother, Antonia, who had walked to the police station year after year. She thought of her uncle Roger, who had carried guilt across decades. And she thought of her own daughters, growing up in a world where DNA tests could do what detectives once could not. If the family had kept Luis's story alive for so long, how could she let the trail go cold now? A chance viewing of a documentary reignited her determination. It told the story of another family who had solved a decades-old disappearance through the same DNA services. Watching, Alida realized, we have the match. We have the proof. The rest is up to us." She began digging again. She searched online for photographs of the man. When she found them, her breath caught. The resemblance was uncanny. The same jawline as her uncle's, the same eyes that mirrored Antonia's. In one picture, the likeness was so strong that she felt a chill run down her spine. "That's him," she whispered. "It has to be him." Alida went further. She visited the Oakland Public Library, scrolling through reels of microfilm. She found the old newspaper clipping from 1951, a grainy photograph of two boys, Luis and Roger, side by side under the headline of a missing child. She held the image next to the modern photograph of the man she had identified. The echo between the faces was undeniable. Armed with this evidence, Alida walked into the Oakland Police Department. For decades, her grandmother had stood in those halls, pleading in Spanish, often ignored. Now, more than 70 years later, her granddaughter returned with DNA results, photographs, and determination. This time, the officers listened. The file was pulled from storage. The FBI and the California Department of Justice were brought in. The story that had lain dormant for generations was suddenly alive again. Federal agents traveled east to make contact with the man. At first, he was hesitant. He had lived his entire life believing he was someone else, raised by a couple he thought were his parents. He was a retired firefighter, a decorated Marine Corps veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He had children, grandchildren, and a lifetime of memories. The idea that he might have been a missing child from Oakland in 1951 seemed absurd. But when the agents explained, when they showed him the photographs and the DNA match, he agreed to provide a sample. The results were indisputable. The man was Luis Armando Albino. For the Albino family, the confirmation landed like a thunderclap. After 73 years, the impossible had happened. The boy they had mourned, the boy Antonia had begged police to find, the boy Roger had never forgiven himself for losing. He was alive. But the revelation carried a bittersweet weight. Luis had not grown up with his family. He had been raised by strangers on the East Coast, never knowing he had been stolen. He had built a life unaware of the truth, serving as a Marine in Vietnam, fighting in jungles on the other side of the world, then returning home to become a firefighter, risking his life again for strangers. He had married, raised children, welcomed grandchildren. He had lived a full life, but one built on the foundation of a lie. He remembered fragments from childhood, hazy images of travel, of being with people who were not his parents. But whenever he asked questions, they were brushed aside. He had accepted the silences, never realizing they concealed the truth of a kidnapping. For his siblings, the revelation was both joy and anguish. Joy, because Luis had survived. Anguish, because their mother had died in 2005, never knowing that her prayers had been answered. Roger, now an old man, trembled when he heard the news. For 73 years, he had carried guilt heavier than anyone could bear. Now, at last, he had proof that he had been telling the truth all along. Luis had been taken. Roger had not imagined the woman. The world had simply refused to listen. The confirmation vindicated decades of persistence. Antonia had been right. Roger had been right. The family's pain had not been in vain, but it also raised questions that may never be answered. Who was the woman in the park? Why had she taken Luis? Was it an act of personal desperation, a calculated crime, or part of something larger, perhaps a black market adoption, as whispered in some circles? Did the couple who raised Luis know he had been stolen? Or had they themselves been deceived? The answers were locked in the past. The woman with the scarf was almost certainly long dead. The couple who had raised Luis were gone as well. The paper trail was thin. The witnesses vanished. The memories faded. The truth, in full, would likely never be recovered. But for the Albino family, one truth mattered above all. Luis had lived. When the FBI delivered the confirmation in June 2024, the case of Luis Albino was no longer just a story of loss. It was a story of survival, of persistence, of science-piercing silence. A test taken for fun had accomplished what generations of detectives could not. For Alida, the moment was overwhelming. She had grown up with the story of her missing uncle as a family myth, a wound inherited through whispers. Now she had helped bring him home. Her first words to him, when they finally connected, were simple but heavy with the weight of decades. "Thank you for letting us find you." The breakthrough was not the end of the story, but the beginning of its final act. Luis would travel back to California to meet the family he never knew, to embrace the brother who had carried guilt for 73 years, to see the faces that mirrored his own. On a warm June morning in 2024, an elderly man stepped off a plane in California carrying a small overnight bag. His gait was steady, though age had bowed his shoulders slightly. His eyes, dark and searching, scanned the terminal with the uncertainty of someone both arriving home and entering foreign ground at the same time. That man was Luis Armando Albino. 73 years earlier, he had left Oakland as a 6-year-old boy, led away by a stranger from a neighborhood park. Now, at 80, he was returning, not as the child frozen in memory, but as a grandfather, a veteran, a retired firefighter, and above all, a survivor of a stolen life. Waiting at the gate was a cluster of faces he had never seen in person, but somehow already knew. Nieces, nephews, great-nieces, cousins. They carried signs, photographs, and tears brimming in their eyes. Among them stood Alida, the niece who had refused to let his story fade into silence. When their eyes met, Alida felt her chest tighten. She had imagined this moment for months, wondered what she would say, how it would feel. But when she stepped forward, all she could manage was a trembling whisper. "Thank you for letting us find you." Luis's eyes softened. He reached for her, his hand roughened by decades of labor, and pulled her into an embrace. "No," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you for finding me." Around them, the family wept openly. Strangers in the terminal paused, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. An old man returning not just to a place, but to a past thought lost forever. But the true weight of the reunion lay beyond the airport. At a modest house in Oakland, Roger, now 83, frail but alert, waited for the brother he had last seen at the age of 10. For 73 years, Roger had carried the guilt of that afternoon, the moment he had run for help and returned too late. The guilt had shaped him, aged him, defined him. When Luis entered the room, Roger struggled to rise from his chair. His hands trembled as he reached out, his voice breaking on the first syllable. "Luis." The two men locked eyes. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then they embraced, tightly, fiercely, as though trying to bridge the decades with the strength of that single hug. Roger buried his face against his brother's shoulder and sobbed. Luis held him, his own eyes wet, his hand patting Roger's back with the instinctive tenderness of kinship rediscovered. "They hugged," Alida would later recall, and it wasn't just a hug. It was history. It was everything that had been lost. Everything that had been carried, everything that had been hoped for, all in that one embrace. For hours, the two brothers sat side by side, speaking softly. They spoke of childhood, of memories fragmented and hazy, of lives lived apart. Roger confessed his guilt, the weight he had carried for 73 years. Luis shook his head. "You were only a boy," he said. "You did what you could." Those words lifted something from Roger's shoulders. For the first time in a lifetime, he allowed himself to believe that the burden was not his to bear. The reunion extended beyond the brothers. Luis met sisters who had longed for him, nieces and nephews who had grown up on the story of his disappearance, great-nieces and great-nephews who now saw living proof that family history was more than myth. He listened as they recounted Antonia's devotion, the daily visits to the police station, the prayers whispered at night, the decades she had spent believing he was alive. When they told him that she had died in 2005, Luis bowed his head, tears streaking his cheeks. "She never stopped looking," he said quietly. "And I never knew." He was shown the faded photograph of himself at 6 years old, standing beside Roger, printed in the newspaper the day after he vanished. He stared at it for a long time, as though searching for recognition in a face that was both his and not his. "That was me," he said finally, his voice filled with wonder. "That was me all along." For all its joy, the reunion carried an edge of sorrow. Roger was already frail, his health declining. Just 2 months after that long-awaited embrace, he passed away. But those who loved him believed he left the world with peace he had never known before. "I think he died happy," Alida said. "For 73 years he carried guilt, and in the end, he got to hold his brother again. He got to know he hadn't failed. He got to see the truth with his own eyes." Luis, too, felt the bittersweet sting. He had been returned to his family only to lose his brother again in a matter of weeks. Yet the time they shared, brief as it was, carried the weight of healing. The hug, the conversations, the forgiveness, they were enough to bridge 7 decades of silence. For the Albino family, the reunion was more than personal, it was historic. It proved that the persistence of memory, carried across generations, could outlast time itself. It proved that technology could breathe life into stories once thought permanently buried. And it proved that even in the face of despair, hope could endure. Neighbors, journalists, and strangers who heard the story wept at its telling. 73 years, one reporter wrote, is longer than most lifetimes. Yet love, memory, and science conspired to give this family the ending they were denied. For Luis, adjusting to the truth was not simple. He had lived 8 decades believing one story of his, life. Now, suddenly, he was asked to embrace another. The parents who raised him were not his parents. The siblings he had thought he never had were here, weeping, welcoming him back. The life he might have had in Oakland, the birthdays, the milestones, the chance to grow up in Antonia's home, had been stolen from him. And yet, Luis refused to sink into bitterness. "I lived a good life," he told his family. "I served my country, I raised children, I have grandchildren, I lost something precious, yes, but I also gained. I can't change the past, but I can be grateful for the present." His words carried a wisdom forged from years of service and survival. But in his eyes lingered the shadow of the boy who had once held his brother's hand at the park, who had trusted too easily, who had been led away with a promise of candy. The reunion in June 2024 did not erase the pain of 1951. It did not answer all the questions, nor undo the decades of grief. But it closed a circle. It gave the Albino family something they had not had in 73 years. A living answer. And in that answer was vindication. Roger had been telling the truth all along. Antonia's faith had not been in vain. The story of Luis Albino was not one of disappearance, but of return. The summer of 2024 gave the Albino family a miracle. Luis was alive. He had lived a long life, built a family of his own, and now, at last, was reunited with those who had never stopped searching. But in the middle of the celebration, another truth lingered. The crime itself, had never been solved. Luis had come home, but the questions that began in Jefferson Square Park on February 21st, 1951, remained. Roger never forgot her. A woman in her 30s, speaking Spanish, a green scarf tied over her hair. She had approached the brothers as if she belonged there, as if she had every right to be speaking to two boys in the park. She had promised Luis candy. And then she was gone. With him. That single detail had haunted Roger for 73 years. Yet it was dismissed by police almost immediately. No composite sketch was drawn, no canvas of the neighborhood for her description, no systematic search for anyone fitting the account. Instead, investigators clung to the theory that Luis had drowned, devoting resources to scouring the bay, while the real trail vanished. Now, with Luis alive, Roger's account was vindicated. But vindication was not identification. Who was she? Did she know the Albino family, or was she a stranger? Did she act alone, or was she only the first link in a larger chain? Even if her identity is lost, another question burns. Why him? Some believe it was random, an impulsive act by a woman desperate for a child, or reckless enough to steal one. Others suspect something broader. Black market adoptions, not unheard of in the mid-20th century, especially targeting poor or immigrant families with limited power to fight back. If Luis was swept into such a network, was the woman paid to take him? Did she hand him directly to the couple who raised him, or did he pass through other hands first? The logistics remain a mystery, blurred by time and silence. Luis's memories of his parents were affectionate. They raised him as their own, gave him their name, sent him to school, and treated him with love. To him, they were his family. But when he asked questions about his earliest years, their answers were vague, evasive. Something always seemed missing. The obvious question is whether they knew. Did they understand he had been stolen from another family? Or were they themselves deceived, told he had been abandoned or orphaned, or given up willingly? Without records, without their testimony, the truth is gone. They died before the DNA revelation, carrying their secrets to the grave. One of the most painful unresolved questions is not about the kidnapper, but about the authorities. Why had the Oakland police been so quick to dismiss Roger's testimony? Why had they clung to the drowning theory with no physical evidence? The Albino family had felt the sting of discrimination. Antonia, a single Puerto Rican mother who spoke little English, was not seen as credible. Roger, only 10, was treated as unreliable. Their cries for help were not heard. If the police had acted differently, if they had canvassed the neighborhood, issued alerts, followed the trail, could Luis have been found before he was taken across the country? That question, perhaps, is the heaviest of all. For the albinos, the reunion in 2024 brought healing but not complete peace. They could now say that Luis had lived, that he had been found. But they could not say who stole him, why it happened, or how it unfolded. Those answers remain sealed away in history, inaccessible after so many decades. Luis himself accepted that reality with stoic calm. "I can't change what happened," he told his family. "I can only live with what I have." His pragmatism softened the edges of the mystery. But for others, especially Alida and the younger generation, the loose ends remain frustrating. The FBI has left the file technically open, but there is little expectation of resolution. Too much time has passed. Too many key figures are gone. Officially, the kidnapping of Luis Albino is still unsolved. And so the Albino family lives with both joy and uncertainty. Joy, because the lost child was found. Uncertainty, because the shadows remain. Who was the woman in the park? Why Luis? Did his adoptive parents know the truth? Could the police have stopped it? These are questions that may never be answered. But the family has learned to live with mystery, the same way they lived with absence for 73 years. 73 years of silence, and one DNA test changed everything. What do you think really happened to Luis in 1951? Was it a random act or something bigger? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories of mysteries solved, after decades, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next case.